In this passage, the prophet Isaiah draws out these three personal behaviors that I think God desires from us. Isaiah says in verse 9, "Remove the yoke from among you, the finger pointing, the wicked speech." Some translations say, "Remove the yoke of oppression from among you." And Isaiah says in verse 10, "Open your heart to the hungry and provide abundantly for those who are afflicted." And he says in verse 13, "Stop trampling the Sabbath. Stop doing things your way, seeking what you want. Set aside time to get away from business as usual." Three calls to action. Avoid the wicked treatment of others through judgment and oppression. Emotionally and tangibly care for our neighbors. Observe the Sabbath. Seek out intentional rest. And in the rest of this passage of Scripture, Isaiah paints a picture of the consequences of these three behaviors. He says, if we can live in these three ways, light will shine in darkness, gloom will be like bright noon, we will be provided for, even in parched places. We will be like well-watered gardens, like springs that never run dry. Ancient ruins will be rebuilt, foundations restored, things broken, mended, unlivable streets renewed and made livable again. He outlines these three tenets of discipleship and suggests that they lead to fullness of life. And it's particularly important to note, I think, that he suggests that they lead to fullness of life not just for us, but for entire communities. In this passage, Isaiah makes a connection between personal lived behaviors of people and the well-being of entire neighborhoods and cities. He doesn't just say, you will be cared for, you will find happiness or peace or favor with God, you will thrive. He specifically draws out these communal, shared implications. Again, he says we'll be like well-watered gardens. Gardens play an integral role in creation. Gardens are connected to the earth and the soil and the sun, and they offer beauty and they offer shade and oxygen and food and sustenance to living things. Just like our community garden that is tended by teams of volunteers and enjoyed by many visitors to our campus and provides food for all kinds of people around our city. Isaiah says that ruins will be rebuilt and foundations of generations will be restored. These are communal projects. They're shared spaces. It's a shared history, and these symbols are about ancestors and their partnerships and their work being brought back to life. Asbury First, this congregation, in its history, has weathered the burning down and rebuilding of church buildings. And those experiences and stories are not about individual triumphs. They're testaments to the strength of partnerships, relationships, shared endeavors, labor carried out together alongside one another. He says streets that have become unlivable will be renewed and made livable again. He paints a picture of the restoration of entire streets, of entire city blocks and neighborhoods, homes to families and friends and colleagues and acquaintances, potholes filled in, boarded up windows replaced with new glass, run-down houses repaired, streetlights added, crosswalks painted, vacant lots turned into usable community spaces, picnic tables put out, rockers added to front porches. All of this made possible by personal behaviors. Isaiah connects the personal with the public, individual behaviors with communal wellness. He suggests here that communities are transformed from the bottom up by people living differently or living in a certain way. He says when we take responsibility for our actions, when we can find unity in our diversity, when we not only recognize systems of injustice and oppression, but actually change our behaviors to avoid participation and complicity in those systems, to avoid upholding those systems, when we recognize our responsibility to our neighbors, when we create alternative ways of being and living and having our needs met, when we break away from prioritizing our way or whatever we want and break the mold of business as usual, seeking out rest and Sabbath, the community can be transformed. A changed heart leads to changed action and changed relationships and changed power dynamics. A rested heart makes space that creates room for healing, restoration, change, something new to come into being far beyond the limitations of ourselves and our lives. When we open ourselves up for God to be at work, when we lean into the way that God desires for us and created us to live, transformation can take place on a larger scale than perhaps we realize. Isaiah connects the personal with the public, individual behaviors with communal wellness. He points out that we have the power together to change our community. We have the power with our fellow congregants gathered here perhaps to change our church community. We have the power with our neighbors to change our neighborhoods. And we have the power coming together with other neighborhoods or other churches or other smaller communities to change our larger community, our city or our towns. We have great influence within our local spheres. We have great potential to shape those spheres through our choices. It can be really easy to forget this and to slip into this mindset that our communities are defined from the top down, that it's our elected officials or our chosen leaders who define a place. But that isn't what Isaiah presents here in the scripture. In other places of the book of Isaiah, the prophet does have pretty harsh words for politicians and elected officials and community leaders who do not take their role and responsibility in community care seriously, or who actively work against the interests of the people that they're supposed to serve. But here in this passage that we're looking at today, Isaiah is focused on the people, on our personal behaviors and our shared responsibility for creating together the world in which we live. Because I think Isaiah recognizes that our role in shaping our world is not just about shaking our fists at those who are in power, or just about installing people with whom we most closely agree into those positions of power. Isaiah points to the importance of accountability for leaders, and he points to the personal, local, bottom-up power that we often fail to tap into and realize. And here in this passage, he says to create a healthy community, to allow for fullness of life for all, we need to do what is within our power to avoid the wicked treatment of others through judgment and forms of oppression, to care for our neighbors and to seek to address their needs, and to observe the Sabbath, to rest. These are not necessarily three easy tasks. It can be difficult to avoid judgment when so much suffering seems to be the direct result of the actions of others. It can be so tempting to just point the finger. It can be really difficult to avoid complicity in oppressing our neighbors when subjugation of certain populations, both seen and unseen, is so built into aspects of our society. And the idea of meeting our neighbors' needs can seem insurmountable and overwhelming and endless. We can feel like we don't have nearly enough to give. And on top of all of that, how are we supposed to take time to rest when there is so much work to be done? Each one of these three behaviors that Isaiah draws out for us is probably worthy of their own sermons. And I think those sermons have been preached here before, and I think they'll be preached here again. So this morning, I just want to briefly try to touch on each of these three behaviors. Avoiding the wicked treatment of others. As I just said, avoiding complicity in oppression is difficult because it often seems like the way our world is set up, any choice that we make connects us to some kind of harm being done. But I wonder if we can raise our awareness of that harm and if we can do what we can to mitigate it. Rachel and I used to have a bumper sticker on our car that said, "Every dollar you spend is a vote cast for the kind of world you want to live in." Choices we make every day are just as political as the ballots that we cast on election day. Whenever we spend money, we are making an investment in the way our world functions. So can we educate ourselves and be intentional about choosing to support more ethical businesses? Can we shop locally whenever possible? Can we support vendors at the Rochester Public Market or at the Neighborhood of the Arts Farmers Market that happens right here on our church lawn? Can we support cooperatives like Abundance Food Co-op on South Avenue or the Genesee Federal Co-op Credit Union on Gregory Street instead of a large bank or a large chain of grocery stores? Can we prioritize patronizing Black-owned or woman-owned or LGBTQ+-owned or immigrant-owned businesses? Can we prioritize patronizing businesses whose workforces are unionized? One commentary I read on this passage this week asks, are we willing to consider how much of our technology is built from conflict minerals? Are we willing to examine how the AI that increasingly becomes part of our daily lives is an environmental and energy disaster that is accelerating global climate change and making survival for humans on the margins even more difficult? And it goes on to say, God will meet needs in difficult times, and there will always be difficult times after upsetting the abusive systems. Let's not kid ourselves. But here's the thing. Ruined structures of community will be rebuilt, and areas that have been impoverished and deserted will instead be home to burgeoning communities that will house generations. Neighbors will know and care for each other on populated streets. This is God's vision for thriving community that is a built-in reward for not tolerating injustice. Making these decisions, seeking to disinvest from oppressive systems, isn't about our holiness or righteousness or purity. It's about recreating our communities and restoring God's vision and promise of fullness of life for all people. Caring for our neighbors and seeking to address their needs. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people who are immunocompromised were at a greater risk of serious illness just going out into public, when people lost their jobs or weren't able to work, when there were widespread supply chain shortages and issues, when existing charitable distribution systems had to rapidly figure out how to completely change their models and scale up immensely what they were doing, local mutual aid networks popped up all over the place. Neighbors started helping neighbors in grassroots ways. People posted needs and other people made purchases and deliveries. Funding, goods, time, and energy were shared with strangers. A sense of responsibility for each other emerged when people realized that they couldn't necessarily rely on organizations and institutions and systems to meet their needs in the same way that they had before. A few years ago, the Southeast Area Coalition here in Rochester started a free tool share on University, just a few blocks away from here. Tools are donated to this tool share, and people can join by paying a small annual fee to become a member. And then they have all year long free access to a wide variety of tools and power tools that can be checked out and returned. This community project makes expensive tools needed for home repair or business repair more accessible to everyone by sharing them and sharing the cost. The sanctuary movement started in the 1980s and continued on for decades when facing refugee and immigrant crises that the federal government wasn't effectively addressing or was actively exacerbating. Local churches just started offering shelter and safety to people, welcoming them in to live in their buildings, and then creating networks of people to help make sure that those families' needs were met. Our small-scale personal actions and behaviors, our commitment to caring for our neighbors can change and lead to fullness of life for our neighbors and our communities. We have the power to be a community that provides for each other's needs. We have the power to be a community where everyone's needs are met. We have the power to be a community that celebrates and protects the sacred worth of all people. And observing the Sabbath, intentionally resting. Perhaps this seems like the oddball out on this list. It's probably easier to see how avoiding oppression of others and caring for our neighbors has effects that ripple out into our broader communities. But Sabbath? Why does Isaiah include rest in this call to action? I think that part of the way that these outside forces from outside of our communities convince us of their power over us, part of the reason we slip into thinking that our communities are defined or shaped by others from the top down, part of the reason we sometimes fail to realize or enact the power we have to shape our own local community is because we are duped into losing track of where our worth and our power comes from. We're constantly bombarded with messaging that suggests that our worth as people in this world comes from our productivity, our standing, our success, our busyness, our ability to make it on our own and be independent and be self-reliant. We're sometimes tricked into chasing our sense of self-worth externally. We chase the assurance that we have value and power and something to offer, and we search for it outside of ourselves. Sabbath is regularly observed periods of rest, non-productivity, emptiness. Isaiah calls it a break from business as usual. To recenter ourselves in the liberating truth that we have worth and value and power just because we are. Just because we are people. Just because we're children of God. Busyness and exhaustion and constant striving and this need for self-reliance get in the way of our ability to realize and live into the fullness of life that God is offering us and offering our communities. They get in the way of our ability to be empowered to creatively shape the community together. We need rhythms of rest and recentering. We need desperately to break out of business as usual in order to reclaim the lives we desire to live and the world in which we desire to live. The lives and the world that God desires for us. I'm really just skimming the surface there, but if you want a much more detailed and concrete explanation of this concept of Sabbath and the importance of Sabbath, go online, go to our sermon archive, and listen to Rachel's sermon, A Case for Sabbath. It does a real deep dive on why Sabbath is absolutely essential. So 1, avoid the wicked treatment of others. 2, care for neighbors and seek to address their needs. And 3, observe the Sabbath, intentionally rest. How is God calling you to change your pattern of business as usual? How is God calling you to invest in shaping our community together? Isaiah tells us that our personal actions, our commitments to these behaviors have the potential to provide fullness of life, not just for us, but for our neighbors and our communities. He says, if we can live in these 3 ways, light will shine in darkness. Gloom will be like bright noon. We'll be provided for, even in parched places. We will be like well-watered gardens, like springs that never run dry. Ancient ruins will be rebuilt, foundations restored, things broken, mended, unlivable streets renewed and made livable again. May it be so.